Good evening, everyone. Good Friday is often described as the Day of Days. That was also the title given to episode 2 of the series Band of Brothers. It was a TV series in part directed by the famous Tom Hanks, which followed Easy Company of the American 101st Airborne Division that landed on the Cherbourg Peninsula on D-Day -1, the night before the invasion. This series follows the men of Easy Company from their recruitment in the United States through their training and their deployment in England. And then comes the great moment of the invasion of Europe, and the particular episode that describes these men gathering themselves into a DC-3, flying over the English Channel in pitch darkness, jumping out of an aircraft over France, was described as the Day of Days. Day of Days is a phrase used to describe a milestone moment or a momentous defining event, and it is used of Good Friday, the day the Son of God was arrested, tried, condemned, and executed on a cross. The Day of Days. Growing up as an older child, early teen, I have very vivid memories of Good Friday in our house. There were certain things that we always did as a family on Good Friday. We always watched a Good Friday movie on Good Friday afternoon. I don't know whether there are any Ben-Hur fans out here. Anybody with me on that? There's 2 of us. Okay, that's great. I loved Ben-Hur, and behind the Ben-Hur story lurks the figure of Jesus, right up until the end of the movie, where Jesus is seen walking from Jerusalem to Golgotha and being nailed to a cross. And it's the death of Jesus that transforms Ben-Hur. Or I don't know whether anybody ever watched that movie, The Greatest Story Ever Told. Does that ring a bell for anybody, or am I just so old now that nobody remembers these movies? I remember it because John Wayne was in it. John Wayne was that Roman soldier that stood at the foot of the cross, and when Jesus died, he uttered those amazing words, "Surely this man was the Son of God," completely destroying that moment. We used to love Good Friday movies, and as a child, I have vivid memories of being moved by those movies. There was something about those movies that captured me, even as a child, even as an early teenager. As a family, we would always go to church on Good Friday evening, and on one particular occasion, there was an elderly gentleman in 2 rows in front of us who, during the singing of one of the Good Friday hymns, knelt down in his pew. He was a man who always walked with a walking stick, so kneeling down in a pew was hard work for him, and it took him an age to get down there. But once he got down on his knees, he clasped his hands like this. And as a young child, I have never forgotten that image of this elderly gentleman lowering himself to his knees in response to the story of the cross. Good Friday, the Day of Days. So I thought this evening it would be good to linger for a moment on the story of Good Friday, but not so much the story, but the explanation, because the Bible not only tells us the story of Good Friday, but it also explains the meaning and significance behind the story of Good Friday. And I've one verse for you this evening. It's from the Apostle Paul from 2 Corinthians 5. We may even have it up on the screens. I hope you can see that. This is 2 Corinthians 5:21. This is Paul speaking. "For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." Can I suggest that just for 30 seconds of silence, reread that verse to yourself just a couple of times and then I'll come back. This is the Apostle Paul's explanation of Good Friday. For our sake. Paul's talking to you and me. For our sake. It was for us. He hung and suffered there. To quote a hymn, for our sake. He, that's God the Father, made him, that is Jesus, to be sin. Who knew no sin? In other words, God the Father put the wrong of the world on his Son, who never ever had done anything wrong. So that there was a purpose in this, so that in him, in Jesus, because of his death on that cross, as a result of what he had done in going to the cross, we, me, you, might become the righteousness of God. That we would be right with God, sinless before God, clean, forgiven, friends with God, sons and daughters of the Most High God. Boy, it's powerful stuff, isn't it? It's powerful stuff. And what I would love to leave with you tonight is summed up in just a phrase that I want to unpack in just in a few minutes. And the phrase is this: the way in is the way on. The way in is the way on. Not my words, they were words spoken by a man called John Wimber. The way in is the way on. He was talking about the cross. The way in is the way on. The cross is God's way in for us. For our sake, he made him to be sin, who knew no sin. At the heart of Good Friday, God in Christ, God in human form, who had never done anything wrong, takes upon himself my wrong. Maybe many of you have heard of an evangelist called J. John, and J. John has a very lovely, beautiful way of describing this moment where Jesus becomes sin for us. And he describes it this way: imagine the hill of Golgotha, and there are the three crosses, and there is the cross of Christ in the middle, and Jesus is hanging on the cross, and darkness descends, the picture of God's judgment coming upon the Son. Darkness descends, and the Father looks at Jesus, and he says, my Son, in this moment, you are Clive. You are Clive Atkinson. And in this moment, my son, you will bear everything he should never have done, everything he should never have said, everything he should never have thought. My son, in this moment, you will bear everything he should have done, should have said, should have thought, but didn't. My son, in this moment, you are Clive. And maybe there was a moment in those 3 hours when the darkness descended where the Father looked at Jesus and said, my son, you are Yvonne. Or he said, my son, you are Izzy. Or he said, my son, you are Daniel. The Bible doesn't tell us that happened, but what the Bible does tell us was that in that moment, Jesus took my sin upon himself. It's hard to imagine never doing or saying anything or thinking anything wrong. What must it have been like to be that person? No shame, no feelings of guilt, no sleepless nights because of a bad conscience, and never wincing at the memory of something done wrong or said wrong, never feeling unclean, no regrets, zero regrets. What must it have been like to have been like that? This was Jesus. He knew no sin. He knew no sin. He was sinless. But because he loves me, he gives himself for me, and he takes upon himself my sin, my shame, my guilt, my regrets, and they become his. It's wonderful, isn't it? And I wonder, does that move you? Does it stir you? Because if the cross is to make any sense at all, then I need to get that my sin matters. You see, the heart of Good Friday is the God of the universe taking my sin upon himself. And we need to get that. We need to get that. Third Saturday in January, I was driving to Belfast International Airport. I was going to go and see my kids and maybe do a little bit of skiing as well. And I was in good form, leaving work behind, off for 7 days. What could be better? Arrived at the airport, handed the car over to Yvonne, got out with my brother and sister-in-law, and off we went for 7 days of holiday up in the mountains. Absolutely beautiful. Came back to a letter, and that letter told me that I had been caught speeding. Oh, oh, you might want to walk out at this point. I had been caught doing, you really want to know what I was doing, wasn't I? I was caught doing 38 miles an hour in a 30. Oh dear. And I was given a choice. Points, and those points don't mean prizes, sadly. Points, or go on a driver awareness course. I chose the course. And on late February, I ended up outside of Ballymena in a hotel at this driver awareness course. I learned so much. Everyone has to go in this, but please don't go in it because you've been speeding. It was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. I learned so much, so much. And there were so many other people there, just like me, but of all ages, and men and women, young and old, truck drivers, car drivers from all over Northern Ireland. But there were lots of us there who were convinced that we shouldn't be there. There was a truck driver who was probably heading towards retirement, driven thousands and thousands of miles. In front of everybody, he effectively said, "I don't deserve to be here." There was a young guy in his 20s, and he said this, "No one is going to tell me how I should drive." And then there was me. He was feeling slightly put out. I was on my way on my holidays. How dare the police put a mobile camera beside Belfast International Airport? I mean, how cruel can you get? But I have to say, as the 2 or 3 hours unfolded, I began to think, maybe I'm wrong about this. And so at the end of the driver awareness course, I went up to them and said, "Listen, I just want to say thank you because this has been good for me to be here today. But can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Why was there a mobile camera outside Belfast International Airport?" I didn't say, "and it shouldn't have been there." And this is what they said to me. "If 4 more people are killed on a section of road, a fixed camera is put in place, a permanent camera. So if you pass a permanent camera anywhere in Northern Ireland, the reason why it's there is that 4 or more people have been killed there. If you see a mobile camera unit anywhere, it means that within the last month, someone has been killed in that piece of road." And he looked at me and he said, 3 weeks ago, a young man was killed crossing the road where you were caught speeding. Do you think I believe that speeding matters now? You're dead right, I do. I thought it didn't matter. I was put out that there was a police camera at Belfast International Airport. I now know why there's one there. And it matters to me now. I was convicted. I was humbled. And that was really good. You see, the cross only makes sense if we really, really realize that our sin matters. That our sin matters to a holy, sinless, beautiful God. And it matters so much, to quote this verse, that for our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin. You see, the cross is God's chosen way in. It's the only way in. And God has invested all of himself in making a way back home for me and for you through the cross. God has poured himself utterly into the cross. The cross is his best way. There is no other way. And it is for you. And it is for me. The cross is God's way in. And the cross is God's way on. I became a Christian over 30 years ago, and I remember the moment vividly. It was the moment I said, yes, please. Yes, please, to this offer of forgiveness, this offer of Jesus taking my sin upon himself. What was God's response to my yes, please? What was the Father's response to my yes to the cross? It was full and free forgiveness. That before the judge of all the earth, I was made right. That before the God of the universe, I am no longer seen as sinful. But he looks at me and treats me as if I am perfectly clean. In fact, when he looks at me, it's as if he was looking at Jesus, who knew no sin. When he looks at me as his friend. When he looks at me as his adopted son. And this is what Paul has in mind when he says this. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God. That I might be made right before God. That I might become the righteousness of God. See, the cross is God's way in. It is also God's way on. The cross is there to remind me where I've come from, and it's to remind me of who I've become. The cross is God's way in and God's way on. In our last church, we used to have an Egyptian Coptic Christian, and on his hand was tattooed a cross. And this is something that's a tradition within Coptic Christianity, is that Coptic Christians are tattooed with the cross. And it's there for a number of reasons. It's there because they live in a majority Muslim country. And it's a reminder to everybody who looks at your hand, sees the cross, they know that person is a follower of Jesus. But it is also there. It is also there to remind the wearer of where they've come from and who they are now. God's way in is also God's way on. The cross reminds me that I am forgiven. The cross reminds me that I am clean. The cross reminds me that I stand before God fully and completely accepted. That when I come into God's presence, God doesn't go, "Oh." He goes, "Son, you're welcome." There's the faintest, I'm going to finish now, the faintest hint of a tradition within the early church, and it is a faint hint, that the Roman soldier who stood at the foot of the cross did himself become a follower of Jesus and was actually part of the community that John led, John who wrote John's gospel. And there is a hint that this Roman soldier would accompany John as John went around the 7 churches spoken of in the book of Revelation. And there is a hint that this Roman soldier was often referred to as the old soldier who had become a great saint despite the fact that he had once been a great sinner. And that's the gift of Good Friday. For our sake, he made him to be sin, who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God.